Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which I'm sad to report is still wrapped in the pandemic. Not that you don't know that already. It's remarkable to me to think that we're right about at the 1 year anniversary of the SARS-CoV-2 virus jumping the biological tracks somewhere in China. It did emerge in China. And moving into becoming a novel pathogen in human beings for the first time. And that was just a year ago now, essentially, before it was fully registering what was happening. And we'll be doing more sessions on that during the weeks to come on lessons learned in this year since then and how to get the signals better and build systems where we can be, as a species and as countries and as communities, more responsive to emergent risks and the risks that hide invisibly around us every day and are impacting lives. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Of course, I'm in the, I guess you'd call it the Hudson Valley Bureau in my home here along the Hudson River, where I've lived for a couple of decades, with a good friend, Jeremy Zilar, for our Monday sessions, which are called Thriving Online. How do we take hold of this reality that more and more of our lives than we might want are unfolding in a digital environment, not in the actual environment. And Jeremy I first met at the New York Times when we were in the early days of Times blogging. He was responsible for developing some of the great systems there and practices there that I learned from him and others. And when I developed .earth, my blog at the New York Times. But Jeremy has had a pretty fantastic career since then, both doing things big and small. Big meaning helping to devise a digital strategy for the government across, go to digital.gov. You can see on Twitter some of the relevant links. And we're developing ways to energize and activate communities and government so that those websites that taxpayers pay for and to provide the services that government offers to the nation, that they work effectively. And he's also done work for the Brooklyn Rail, and he's out and around and seems happy to answer questions all the time. So we're going to have an open hour or so to get your input. I wanted to start, Jeremy, you're in New Mexico somewhere, right?
Yeah, we're out in northern New Mexico up near Taos. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you were on broadcast number 1, essentially, back March 15th. It was a Sunday when I found this thing called StreamYard and dove in and started this iterative enterprise called Sustain What. And you offered some really valuable advice even then about what was emerging, even the language. I remember you were the first person I heard say that social distancing isn't what we want. Physical distance is what we want. Social distancing is not necessary. You can be socially connected.
Yeah.
At a distance. I do want to start with a little music. Don't ask me why. I just feel like this stretch we're in right now deserves a little dose of auto harp. It's an
great.
Ancient instrument, and here in the hands of my good friend Tom Chapin, Hudson Valley musician extraordinaire. He sang a song called "Come In, the Door Is Open" that he had written about how to overcome some of the divisions in this time we live in. Let's see if this works. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Come in, the door is open. You are welcome here. Come in, the door is open. Leave out all doubt and fear. We'll plant a seed together, and together watch it grow, and learn once more what we already know. Lift up your voice, rejoice in what we've found. Let every heart take refuge in the sound. Feel the walls around us tremble. We will surely bring them down and find ourselves on common ground. find ourselves on common ground. This is how we celebrate our song and dance and art. This is how we touch the future, how we touch our heart. Tell your story to a child and they'll take it as their own. This is how we learn we're not alone. Lift up your voice, rejoice in what we found. Let every heart take refuge in the sound. Feel the walls around us tremble, we will surely bring them down. And find ourselves on common ground. Find ourselves on common ground. I haven't played this in a while. In our time together, I begin to understand there are bridges we can only cross together, hand in hand. Soon we'll head on homeward, we'll go our separate ways, but these echoes will be dancing down our days. Lift up your voice, rejoice in what we found. Let every heart take refuge in the sound. Feel the walls around us tremble, we will surely bring them down. And find ourselves on common ground. Find ourselves on common ground. Oh,
So the door's open. Actually,
on earphones on so I can hear you.
On Twitter,
oh my God,
you can hear. Folks can find the link to come actually join us face to face if they want to after in about 10 minutes. But I wanted to start, just talking with you about your experience and building workflows and environments that can be sustainable. So much of what communities and individuals have been forced to do, from academia to commerce, is to get online and do things that normally they did in a hallway. We're going to talk about several questions that are on my mind. Questions are on your mind too. So let me just change the landscape here and say thanks again, Jeremy Zilar, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate in Tom's song just the refrain kind of going over and over again about common ground, which is really just about, I mean, that's what you're getting at when you're working with other people and collaborating to build stuff and to make stuff, is finding common ground, common language, to be able to kind of move forward together. So when the question of building sustainable systems comes about, I kind of think a lot about, like, well, how do we build adaptable people? How do we build adaptability into our processes, so that and how do we make the tools and the things we're using adaptable? Because change is inevitable and change does happen. You just want to make sure that, like, change doesn't disrupt you.
Right.
hold you back from creating. So
what you just said there is interesting, because I think a lot of us think about solutions to online being a new feature on Zoom, like, breakout rooms or some of the whiteboard devices. But you're talking more about internal innovation or internal capacities.
yeah, well, I mean, at all times we have needs for stability. We have needs for change and delight and surprise and to be moved and to be heard and all those things. And it's when you're working with other people and let's say you're building some sort of system, or you're building some sort of thing, or trying to affect change, like, to collaborate, you do need to kind of come together and have empathy for each other, and that you need to understand kind of the direction you're going and what your objectives are. So you need to find that common ground in order to work with each other. And then through that, like, that's your focus, right? Those outcomes and those objectives that you're aiming to change. And then the tools we use, like, as long as that objective is super clear, like, the tools become just means to reach that objective. And the tools are going to change on a regular basis. So, and for some,
Right.
it disrupts people more than others. And if you're somebody that's super fluid with technology, it's important to understand that some people aren't, and just kind of make sure that you're bringing everybody along.
So talk a little bit about digital.gov and what you did there. It's certainly the biggest landscape I know that you've worked in, .earth and the stuff you did at the New York Times, we can go back to as well. But I'm still interested myself in that Ideas Act and how that unfolded. And how do you talk about a challenge? How do you get people across agencies of government, thousands of employees, to work effectively in building these online landscapes that we all rely on?
Well, yeah, so I should kind of go back and say that I got pulled into government through doing a bit of work with the Obama administration, and they were doing a lot of really great initiatives to make technology better and more accessible for people. So one of them was a agency named called 18F, and I joined 18F as a strategist. 18F is a government agency, but it's also like a digital agency that works on projects in government. And everything they do is human-centered and human-focused and in the open. And they put a lot of really great practices around it. And one of the things that I learned, like, quite immediately from the then director of 18F was just the biggest problem in government is they lack a lot of hiring designers and developers in-house to help them figure out what they need. So they just lack the language. They lack kind of, and the familiarity with the tools. So
I never had heard about 18F.
Yeah, 18F is a really great initiative that sort of spawned in the year after the healthcare.gov crash back then. So there was a few other things that started. One was the Presidential Innovation Fellows. The other was 18F, and another one was the U.S. Digital Service. So there were a lot of really great initiatives to be able to pull people in to do the right technology work in government. Because government, for the most part, and this extends from the federal government to state to local to even as we talked with governments around the world, and big companies too have the same problem, is they outsource a lot of that knowledge and technology to contracting groups. And a lot of times they outsource the decision making and how it should happen, or they don't provide the right kind of structure framework to how to think about software. So the biggest problem in government is actually the federal government spends $86 billion a year in technology, and which is I have no idea if that's a big amount or a little
Yeah,
amount. Honestly, like, I mean, technology is hard to make, right? That's not,
right.
it's not the size of it that matters. It's the fact that like that the average contract that the government writes is many hundreds of pages long. And then by the time, which basically means the project is too big, and by the time it um, gets awarded, it's the average contract is 5 to 7 years long. So that means 5 to 7 years to build a piece of technology. And then by the time
Right.
it's finished, 96% of it never sees the light of day. So there's a 96% fail rate on $86 billion. Now,
Wow.
granted, if you know, Google probably has a fail rate on stuff that they do, but it's probably below 50. You know, I wouldn't say it should be zero by any means, but you should be able to make stuff, but things need to be smaller and things need to be scoped better. So
Yeah.
and scoped better for people and for the public. So, but
Especially,
oh, go ahead.
well, especially because the whole idea is to create that interface between public and the things that government can do for the public.
Yeah. And then the people in government are there's so many great people working in government, kind of keeping the agencies running, keeping public services running, keeping the data flowing, and it's quite remarkable to see firsthand and to get to meet these people. But a lot of these people, you know, they have backgrounds in science or in law or policy or in different backgrounds. They don't have backgrounds in web development or, you know, in the technology aspects to make this happen. So, and they're often responsible for, you know, advocating for their work and communicating that work out to the public or making that service now digital. So,
and the other thing that comes to mind in what you were talking about, the timescales you were talking about there, is when something like the pandemic emerges, the last thing you want is a 5-year program to develop a widget called X for some
yeah,
putative application that might not pan out, as opposed to how do you build, whether you're a university or the government or a company, the agility and the sort of the ability to kind of build live. Is that part of the frontier or the challenge here?
I think that's always the challenge. I mean, even outside of government, is to harness when there is a fire, is trying to realize that how you operate and handle in that situation is probably how you're going to do it in kind of worse case and more difficult times. So it's actually not that different from being at the New York Times and working on breaking news. So
Right.
there were so many times we were developing and working on tools or the way publishing happened or just the way communication happened between editors, reporters, or even people at different locations while it was a soccer game or a playoff game in the NFL. And all of that was done just so that we know that if we can increase the efficiency of that communication and feel like our publishing flow is fluid there when it matters, when there's a bigger event and people need this information, we'll know how to get there faster and more reliably. So.
Yeah, the New York Times has certainly shown agility these last few years. I wonder if you and I were just a little bit ahead of the curve in some of that, what we were wishing for there sometimes. It takes big enterprises time to evolve and innovate.
And it's the thing that I found, I heard some from somebody, I'm forgetting which agency she was at, but she was really starkly surprised that a lot of internet stuff is really messy, or that there's messy processes behind the veneer. And things do start out messy. They start out very scrappy, and you got to sort of be comfortable with that. And I find, again, going back to like interpersonal connections with those that you work with, the ways that you deal with that mess is by sticking together and co-owning that mess, or co-owning the tape and glue that's kind of pulling something together so that it can get better over time.
So that, what you just described there, and I think in talking with you about some of this before, that idea where you mentioned about the times and soccer games, or developing something when it's the practice and the relationships,
Yeah.
not when the epic crisis is happening or when they do, but creating that is to have that plasticity there when you need it more with more agility. That seems like something that's applicable to at almost every scale.
It definitely is. There's a whole, in the technology landscape, there's a people work on design systems, and it's a system. It's basically systematic thinking, right? So you're building things so that they're somewhat reusable, or so that the principles behind them can guide and inform how the thing gets used or things get made or whatnot. But you're building things that then can, instead of making individual things, you're building systems or the right conditions for something to occur. In the federal government, actually, I was on the Federal Web Council, and they largely existed because there was such a need for agencies to cooperate around emergencies, at which I found it really interesting, like how federated the government is, and how much each agency sort of had its own identity or own way of actually operating around the world, which I don't want to shoot down in any way. I mean, the need for collaboration is super important, but the need for also being unique and deciding to be unique in a particular case is also just as important. And so finding a way for that collaboration to work, and for people to decide not to be part of something for a specific reason, is really important. So, but it was nice watching them work and learning from them. They really came into action around hurricanes, around mobilizing communication, like in Hurricane Marina, and just the support, the way in which they can mobilize to get staff from around the government to help with things. So it was really nice to kind of see that behind the scenes. And I always wished that was a little bit more visible. I think it would make the case for at least what efficiency was happening in government at the time.
There were some, on one of the websites for digital.gov, let me see. I'm not sure how directly you were involved with developing these guiding principles.
Oh yeah, I wrote them.
Yeah, I had a feeling. So this feels like a good guide to some of what you were talking about. And I think, what I often see, even, Columbia University has all these compartments and parallel practices and disciplines and law and engineering. And part of what I'm trying to build here is a landscape for collaborative potential, similar to what you're talking about. And this relates to the climate school that's being built here too, which will cross disciplines. It's not a school of climate science. It's a school of the climate problem. And what do we do? And that's just at Columbia. And I know people all over at organizations or in communities that are eager for some of this knowledge or insight on how to progress. Could you just work through, you don't have to go tick down the entire list, but when you see this, what's the menu to start with for figuring out how to create a landscape of communicative, collaborative potential?
I think you have to meet people where they're at, like, which is kind of baked into a number of one of these here. But when you're in a situation, you need to bring people together, and you need to understand, like, what are their assumptions, what are their needs and the desires, what do they need out of this collaboration? Why are they here? Collaboration and community generally solve around common sets of problems. And you need to make sure that, like, the people you're with have the same understanding of the problem, or that you have a better understanding of what, how they understand kind of what the problems are. So I think that's evident there in making collaboration easy. All those things help to do that. We wrote a lot of guidance for government agencies, and a lot of the things that would get in the way were people trying to make the guidance over important or over credit certain agencies or teams for doing something, and which veers into the world of PR or world into giving people credit or giving organizations credit. And I always wanted to just find a way to, like, we need to talk about the specific people and the specific roles and the specific challenges that they're overcoming or that they overcame. Not like, hey, this big agency did this thing, because that doesn't really help anybody else who actually needs to also overcome these challenges.
That's so interesting. And I think you had at digital.gov, you did a weekly idea, or you were trying to engage individuals within government to tell stories and share them across the agencies. That seems to be part of this. When you talk about work in the open, or make sure these innovations are sort of sprinkled out there in a way that everyone can intersect with.
Yeah. So we ran 22 communities of practice across government, and these were essentially listservs and partially on digital.gov as kind of community landing pages. In addition to the communities, we held online video chats and conversations, and digital.gov is still doing these, and they're free and they're open for anybody to go and join in and learn about. And so there'd be conversations around plain language, conversations around social media, around security, around working in a more agile way, all kinds of different things, like getting into the cloud. So kind of whatever was burning and whatever kind of people's big challenges they were facing. But it was always, like any community work, you need to create space for people to be able to talk about problems or talk about challenges they're having. Most people tend to go direct. So if I'm having an issue, I will DM you or email you individually, whereas it's a little bit more beneficial to everybody if I can ask that in an open space where you're at and have you answer in that open space, because then maybe your question or your advice gets questioned a little bit when other people learn, or somebody comes along 2 months later and they can learn from the answer that was posted. So I think we were always working to just make problems more visible and be able to talk about problems. That was a very, coming from the news background and then going into government and looking at the degree to which everything was so press heavy, and so the fear that was there about, like, well, we can't talk about a problem because that's gonna, without a solution. But being able to talk about a problem without a solution in a open, kind of humble way, I think is the first step towards actually solving it and building, I think, the collaboration you need to solve it in very human-centered ways. So.
And how does that relate to, well, the other thing people need is not just the authority, but the actual time in their day to devote to that intersectionality and outreach and stuff. Yet a lot of our norms for how businesses and, well, I'm sure government agencies work and universities work, it doesn't really leave a lot of space for that. At Columbia, there is one interesting group. It's very informal. The social media, a woman named Acacia O'Connor, who's one of the directors of Columbia's overarching social media landscape visibility. She's created kind of an ad hoc group that informally meets every couple of weeks to share experiences. It feels like that has some of that, but it's not a job description thing. It's kind of people that find that time in their world. Have you found ways within communities to make that more of a normal, empowered capacity?
I think, well, your question reminds me of something. There was a editor that I think we worked a lot with at the New York Times, Catherine McElroy, and who's, I think, down UT Austin now, but she would talk a lot about just needing to teach people how to be public. And there's this fear of like, well, what does it mean to be public? And I think it was her that was always saying, well, you just got to figure out like who you're talking to, because then you know how to talk to those people, even though that it's public. It's not the fact that it's public, it's just that your audience changes, and it changes the way you write or the way you communicate, right? And so, and then outside of that, I think people just need practice doing it, like public speaking a little bit. In community settings, I found, and I get to commiserate with a lot of journalists, kind of friends that run different websites, and they're like, yeah, getting people to write things is really hard. So it's like, that's hard work. So things that I found to be the most effective were making sure that the community space was a place where discussion happened and the debate and asking really good questions, setting up rhythms for those things to happen. So sort of running a listserv a bit like a radio show or a week-long kind of programming. So whereas on like Monday, you might have a series of questions that kind of go in and you highlight some things people said. And then on Thursday, you check back in and you recap the week at the end of the day on Thursday, and with some interesting insights. And it keeps the place feeling alive, like it's a place people want to be and they know they can come back to. Also knowing that like only 10% of people probably comment or reply and say stuff. And so keeping tabs on when somebody's new and they say something and kind of validating that, I think is super key. Validating people who are kind of stepping out in a different way.
That's really interesting.
But the things that were really effective were when somebody did have that question, is finding a way to support not answering it myself, but finding a way for others to come in and support and answering that. And then elevating that up onto digital.gov. So there was so much that happened, like so many of our resource pages on there were created because somebody asked a question in a listserv. And then, we just would ask, tell me more, keep digging and try to find out. And who else has this problem? Is this the case elsewhere? Is this something we should centralize? Should we do this? And then just quickly moving to create a messy first draft. And the messy first draft, even if it's wrong, like helps move it in that direction. And I would find that people would step in to say, I'm happy to take that and edit it and add some more stuff, which is wonderful. But making it real and tangible in the beginning was super key. So
this gets to tools a little bit, because when you think about shared documents and like, I think we're all immersed in a world of Google Docs and Slack, and I don't know if you've seen tools again or practices less than tools that make that more organic and doable, creating a shared document and the like. And by the way, Ophelia Manjan is going to be joining us shortly. I think she just popped into the room.
Wonderful.
I have an open link out for folks on Twitter. You can join us face to face. If there is a banish button, so no Zoom bombing is possible here, which is very good to know. So, well, tool wise or practice wise, what comes to mind as a key?
I think you want to make the work visible as fast as possible. And it's hard to say for tools. Like coming from government, it was a hard space to work in. I mean, you had different agencies that had access to different sets of tools.
Yeah.
So, I mean, most reliably of tools, like you could send a Microsoft Word document around, but the GSA all operated on Google Docs. So, so you sort of kept tabs on which other agencies you could share Google Doc which was very, very small. But getting actually the most universal platform, at least in, and I want to say this from like an access standpoint, but not necessarily from an ease of use, is GitHub, which, you know, is typically used for engineers and developers to document and program code, but we would end up using it for ways to just do research reports or to start a draft of, as put information out there because it was open and it was reliable and I could send it to somebody and kind of keep moving that forward. So, but I guess it always depended. Like I wasn't against writing the thing up in a Google Doc, exporting it as a PDF or a Word document and sending it out to the community to see if others want to take it and run with it. So, but the important part was making it out there and making it visible and tangible.
And there's always this question for me: visible at which level? Like within an organization or open to the community. These webcasts are open to all, and we do internal trainings as well. And so that's one of those questions that comes up. I'm going to bring Ophelia in now. It's great to see her. Hello.
Hello.
You have met before. I think had you already met, right? Or did I introduce you?
Yeah, wonderful seeing you again.
Nice to see you too. Nice to see you too. I'm glad that I was able to jump in for a moment. And it's always wonderful to hear from you. I think I probably missed all of the good introduction stuff, but I'll have to watch the recording later. I'm not sure, Andy, how do we see how many people are tuned in right now? Or is there
right now there's it's a little quiet, you know. There's some people on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's actually most active right now, and on Twitter, Periscope, 11 people are on. So it's like there's a little index there. These things tend to get more interactive later too, as I keep them flowing in conversation.
Wonderful. Well, if I may throw a question into the mix for you to answer whatever works for you, Jeremy, I'm really curious to hear what your digital life is like these days. Certainly any small wins that you could share with the rest of us who are trying to figure it out every day.
Well, our digital life, I will say, we were in our tiny apartment in New York City for most of this pandemic, and we ended up coming out to New Mexico just so that we could be outside. But three of us, me and my wife and an 11-year-old, we're all basically on video chats all day. So that was hard. Sound spaces was hard. It was hard to basically find a space where you could talk and not have to overlap with others. So I don't know if that is digital life. That's just life, like, and now in kind of space. And I am probably, for my whole time in government, I worked remotely out of New York, but would go down to DC every 6 weeks or so for a couple days. But so I was used to doing that, but I found that, it is still like this digital life can feel like, now in the pandemic, it feels like viewing the world through a paper towel tube. You just kind of only peering in. It's the small interactions that I miss the most, like, and all the micro exchanges, because I have some fantastic discussions with friends and family and new groups, and I love that aspect of it. But I miss like the guy at the bodega, where you got the coffee, or the person at a gym that you saw that just all those small interactions with people and all the people that I miss those people, and I miss those interactions.
So Ophelia, could you fill folks in on your role? You had been at the journalism school. You have a background in education, designing for education, the PhD, and the architecture of how to turn knowledge, move knowledge, and create knowledge. And now you have a new role at Columbia, which is really exciting to me.
I do indeed. So I'm almost exactly a month into my new role as the Associate Director of Education Design and Technology. Wow. And I'm technically the first, and right now, for a very short period of time, I hope, the only full-time employee of Columbia's new climate school. So a big part of what I'm working on right now is actually bringing it into being and in the official administrative sense. The idea, as you know, has been around for much longer, and I'm excited to be working to design the educational programming, working with a whole lot of people at Columbia. My job is to operationalize all of the wonderful thinking that's happening right now. And so, yeah, Andy's putting some things up on the screen right now from the director of the Earth Institute and some other wonderful things online and ideas from President Bollinger as well about why we need a climate school. And yeah, it's nice it's wonderful to be in a moment of getting to imagine. But, one of the directives that we've been given is that this needs to be different. We need to approach this in a new way. So figuring out what that means and getting to work with so many brilliant minds at Columbia and elsewhere, including Andy, and hopefully we'll get to pick your brain a bit too as things move along, Jeremy.
Yeah. Well, could I ask, do you have any early hypotheses for at least what 2021 might look like?
For the climate school
program,
specifically, for the program. Yeah. So there are a number of committees and working groups right now who are trying to work very quickly to make those types of decisions. The programs will be launching in September of 21. The rest of it I have to leave for others to share and explain the details when the time sort of comes. But I can say we will be continuing in the wonderful work that Columbia and the Earth Institute have done historically, both for the degree granting types of programming for students who are enrolling to say get a master's degree, and then also we're going to be doing some really wonderful non-degree programming. So very what Andy is doing and so many others, including the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, the Act Today, which is a Columbia World program, etc. And so it's wonderful to really think about the resources and services that we need to develop and have in place to support so many different kinds of learners and so many different kinds of learning environments, from emerging technology and XR spaces all the way through to literally sitting underneath the tree, right? Learning environments really run the whole gamut. And when I talk about designing learning experiences, we're always asked, who are the learners, right? Big piece of that is what do they already know, but also what kind of tech do they not or have access to? And then that third question is, what is the learning environment? And always centered around what are they learning? What's the content? So if we have content that exists in a virtual reality environment, then what does that material look like when it's in an analog form? Making sure that everything is inclusive and accessible as well. So that's the systems architecture that I'm speccing out and trying to design, covering all those bases.
And what's interesting about that to me, again, when Jeremy was talking earlier about the work with digital.gov, which is all about this sort of creating the interlaced conversations for spreading impact or innovation across the websites of government. The climate school architecture, for sure, because it's about the climate problem. It's not just climate science. It's social science, it's law, it's engineering. It has to have that same plasticity and the same capacity for groups to sort of come together, whether it's to develop a course or to create that interface with the communities. We were just talking about this I was on a committee this morning meeting about what's leadership look like in this century. It's very different than leadership or academia in the last century. So it has to have that agility, plasticity, but again, measurable impact and all that stuff. That's why it feels like the conversations we're having here, these thriving online sessions on Mondays, are really very much a part of that grand question of how do you break down some of the walls, but also, drive things forward. I've had Ophelia and I have had these conversations about that aspect. So it's not just even this broadcast I do, which started, on a Sunday. I haven't had time to really step back and say, okay, how do we measure impact? How do I define these tracks of conversations we're doing on climate resilience, on pandemic preparedness, so that there's coherence and a sense of what's the next step That seems to be a really important general imperative.
Well, just to build a little bit off what Ophelia was saying around creating spaces that work for all different types of learners. Like I think this is stuff I was thinking a lot about after our the last conversation. It's like 18F, this agency in the federal government where I was at, was remote by default. And or we didn't call it remote, we called it distributed, because if it was remote, it meant somebody else was not remote. So it was the distributed teams. And what was interesting is we thought a lot about like how we work together and to make it sure that it's accessible for everyone, because some people are better learners and process information through reading. Some people need special time to process stuff. Other people learn through talking or through video or through repetition more, you know, and just you need to be accommodating for people and their needs so that they can be successful at what they do. And you need to create safe space for that. So that was a huge part of working there, was about actually talking about the space that we create for each other and making space for difference. So
I'm showing
I just
people
think about that a lot in
yeah.
relation to that future of education type of stuff. So.
And it turns out, Jeremy, that all the things that you do to meet the WCAG 2.1 guidelines, anybody who isn't familiar with that, check out the Ally Project. It's actually a really wonderful resource to explain digital accessibility, what it means, and how we can all contribute to making the web a space that is inclusive in that way. It turns out that meeting those accessibility standards is actually beneficial to all learners. And maybe that's a different conversation of delving into that, but it really does, it benefits everybody.
It's a really great strategy. Like just saying, if you just kind of go out with making stuff that's very accessible to a lot of different types of learners, like it's a really winning strategy for any type of communication you do.
Well, in fact, Andy's point about interdisciplinarity as well, I think creating a space that, you know, where there's some, you know, cohesion instead of standardization. We're talking about inclusion instead of accommodation. They're not these dualities, but rather looking at the continuums and how people can participate, right? And I think about this in this space of sustainability and resilience and responding to climate issues and looking at climate action. The framework I put there is sort of, you know, the dynamic interplay of ethos and information and action, right? And where are you orienting your work, and how are you helping somebody get to the next space if that's what they need to do? Do they share the ethos or not? What information so much has been focused on information and that being the catalyst for attitude and behavior change. And unfortunately, it's been woefully inadequate to the incredible task that we sort of have at hand. You know, inclusion, yes, during the pandemic, but in the post-pandemic space, there was some optimistic news about, you know, maybe maybe the time, maybe summer 21, right? Vaccines being available, we can start sort of thinking about that, how we hang on to these digital, you know, spaces and connections as a means of inclusion, but also making sure that there's these in-person and sort of analog places can connect, right? And there's no sort of one answer to any of it. That's kind of what I love about it. I'm excited too, because I learned so much in my work, and I'm getting to work with some of the world's preeminent experts in climate science, in communication, technology as well. So I'm always sort of feeding that back into what I'm doing, and designing, you know, again, these resources and services to support creating effective learning experiences here.
Jeremy, we can't talk about government right now without talking about the transition that's underway in government right now.
Yeah.
And when you think about the work you were doing at GSA and digital.gov, and again, in this broader context of online impact, are there new opportunities you could foresee happening in the new administration? You talked about that $86 billion a year spent on tech. Let's assume part of that's on education and sustainability and resilience education, so if there's some component there that hasn't been really explored enough so far, what might happen going forward?
I
I'm
would,
particularly interested in resilience, and Colombia, a big chunk of the climate thinking here now and in the future is about the resilience, community empowering to reduce climate hazards and like. So, what is there? Is there a landscape of opportunity coming?
I would say, and this is a very strange answer. Like it baffles people. But one of the things that you see when, as a technologist, as somebody that goes into government, like the thing that you come out learning and talking a lot about is the topic of procurement and how things are purchased, how contracts are written, and then and it seems absurd because if you've not been in government, you're like, why are you talking about this like purchasing a little aspect of things? And it is getting that right is possibly one of the most essential things to systematic change overall. And I don't want to claim that I'm an expert in like what should happen with what's called the FAR or procurement, but I do know that there are a lot of really great minds on that problem. There's two people that I worked with at 18F, Robin Carnahan and Waldo Jakewith, and they were working on a fantastic project at 18F to help states kind of unblock kind of this process and the tech process, because states have the same problem that the federal government does. And they've put together this incredible handbook, which I'll pull up some links, but for state governments on how to build and buy better technology and make better digital services. And it's quite incredible. And I know that they're, doing a lot of work, I think, with the U.S. Digital Response team that's from Code for America, that was kind of spawned out of Code for America around COVID relief with states and kind of what that might look like. But in terms of change, I have no doubt that like technology, that at least the ethos around building better technology or services in government will be more human-centered, or will continue to be human-centered and accessible. It's something that one thing that I found surprising going from being in government during the Obama administration, and then as the Trump administration came in, or what of it came in, because they didn't really hire that many people, was from the start, there was a huge focus on accessibility and huge focus on plain language and clarity. And I found that really surprising. And that when I heard from a number of people in government saying, oh yeah, every time Republicans are in office, the language gets way more clear. And every time Democrats are in office, language gets way more academic. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. So it was just nice. There was also a huge push during the Trump administration to do more around multilingual, or make services available in Spanish and other languages, which I found to be interesting. So, I'm guessing those things won't go away. Like there's certain things and practices and habits and stuff that get built in. But it's about making sure that those ideas get built and they get tested and they get put out there and that they remain iterative.
Right.
That's as opposed to building like the whole thing.
Waiting and building. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier with the government spending on tech tends to be long-term and a grand thing as opposed to boosting those general capacities. Before Ophelia has to leave, I wanted to ask the one question that Jeremy encouraged me to ask everyone on this show every week. Back on March 15th, on the first one, you said, what's something we can do, like an actual thing we can do next week or tomorrow that can iterate us forward a little bit toward some achievement that we all desire? And so I'm going to ask you both, is there something we can do differently, either with this broadcast, with our plans for, with something with Jeremy, with that digital.gov ethos as it relates to Colombia, What can we do tomorrow or next week that might be a little different? Take us forward a step.
You wanna take that one first, Jeremy?
Well, sure. Thank you for asking that question, Andy. It's like I feel like I should start out each week with a note that says, how am I moving the world better this week in one way, right? What is one thing? And there's we do a lot of work with the Brooklyn Rail and Arts Organization in New York, and we've done a ton of work over the course of this pandemic to kind of build up to do these talks around artists and or with artists from around the world and connect those communities. And a lot of the things that we've learned is that nonprofits have an incredible amount of trouble staying alive and staying relevant and using technology. And there's a lot of practices that we're doing at the Rail. So maybe there's some things that maybe this week I can put out in a more packaged way that we can start to push out at least to the other art partners around the Brooklyn Rail, around like how to build a donation platform that doesn't eat up 20% of your donations as a service fee, right? Which there's fairly simple like open source tools for doing this type of stuff, or how to like just build better community, or how to just manage your data a little bit better. There's a couple kind of internal handbooks that we have that maybe we can do more to put out there. So
yeah, and some of the resources that were on the digital.gov pages that you pointed me to seem applicable to any big organization.
They were written to be as focused towards any digital problem where applicable. So.
And Ophelia, before you head into your next round, any quick thoughts?
Yeah, maybe this is I think something that applies more to some of the hardware discussions, and Jeremy was talking about procurement, and oftentimes when friends and family who I've been talking to about these issues for a long time sort of tune in, and everybody kind of has a moment of like, oh no, like, this is a lot, like how do I even begin? I encourage people to sort of start small because it lets them build capacity actually relatively quickly. And just to start with, the next time you're shopping for anything online or not, to ask 3 questions of everything that you purchase, right? And where does it come from? You find out really quickly that it's not so easy to answer most of the time. Learn a lot about what those cute little frog labels or fair trade mean. There's a reason it costs a couple of dollars more, and finding out what that is, it's part of the story there. The second question is, why do I have it? And if you don't like the story of where it came from and the reason you have it is for convenience, and maybe that invites an opportunity to do something different, or find another way. And there are a lot of options, more and more options these days too. And the last question is, where is it going, right? And there's some fascinating videos online about local recycling systems and landfills. There are places you can even go visit, or will be able to again sometime, to sort of learn more about what happens. I don't police like people's recycling bins when I go to visit, but I find sometimes even the most like conscientious and mindful people, say, have been living in New York for a long time. The city shifted away from recycling like plastic bags, right? Any kind of wrapping that's plastic, and they dutifully are doing everything, separating, and then putting that in there, and that means that bag of all the recycling is going to end up in the landfill, right? So like those little things, like technology changes, so do recycling practices. Where's it going when I'm done with it? And if you like the answer to sort of all 3 of those questions, and that can kind of create some space to start chipping away at the small things that we all can contribute that are in our locus of control. But times billions of people really genuinely do add up, and that is a space where we can affect change.
That's great. Yeah, that reminds me. Jeff Schlegelmilch, who runs the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here, he kind of had the same idea early in the pandemic about information. So where did that information come from? why am I paying attention to it?
Yes.
And is it doing anything for me? He described this here also on this broadcast. He said the fire hose of information, it's not actionable and may even be dangerous. So think about that, whether it's material product or how much time we spend, doom scrolling or the like. He says, review the latest information, focus on the source, ask if it's useful to you, in some policy landscape you have to deal with, and then go forward. And I think that, those are practices, again, whether it's material consumption or information consumption, we have work to do. And universities and folks like Jeremy Zilar can do a lot to foster that capacity. I'm just showing one last thing here.
Sorry, Andy.
I know you got to go.
I gotta run. But
Great to have you
thank
here.
you very much. So nice to chat with you both. Thank you, Jeremy. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Enjoy New Mexico.
Thank you.
More
Bye.
to come. Jeremy, hang in there a little bit.
Yeah.
So getting back to, that was great. Ophelia Manjan again is a Columbia PhD education designer who is now taking on the task of building the architecture for the climate school that's coming, which is really exciting.
She's amazing.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to working with her. She was one of the first people I met here a little over a year ago, and I'm really glad she's going to be part of this sustainability climate landscape. I'm showing this image here, Jeremy, because it's about something you mentioned earlier, which is so that someone like you personally is not necessarily dealing with the exchange of insights. And how do we build a community where those who are enthusiastic or have an idea of how to use social media, for example, effectively, can more organically find and or work with people who are hesitant, who could be part of creating a better landscape of impact, whether it's internal at an agency or external in terms of being part of the social media landscape of the constructive part of it. At Columbia, I did a survey very early on of people who connected with the Earth Institute. And there are these cohorts out there. I imagine this is true almost everywhere. You can see for social media, there are 40% of the respondents. Obviously, the respondents are a small chunk of the community who said they're enthusiasts. They're 15% said they're evangelists. They're beyond enthusiasts. And there's a 25% who were hopeful but hesitant, and 14% who are grudging. And I would feel, I'd love to be able to take this survey. This was like 6 months ago, like 6 months from now, and find a little different landscape there. But so how do you build that connectedness? And
I have to
or is
say,
that like
and
not useful?
Well, I have to say, I'm tempted to turn this into a clock. Actually, this image you have here, I just can't figure out where to put the 12 o'clock hour, because this is me throughout the whole day.
That you have a cycle of feeling
basically, yeah, I hit all these points in the day.
That's so interesting.
So I think this would be a fantastic clock. Let's work on making that. That sounds like fun.
Is it a diurnal cycle of hopefulness?
It might be, yeah. But I'm just trying to figure out like when the never is, and it's probably more towards the evening, I guess. But but when it comes to social media, like I guess my first reaction always is like, well, all media is social, and people are social, and they do things as social. And so like, I find the word problematic and that concept problematic. It's, it's just a name for how we chat. But focusing around what those core problems are that a community wants to solve and go in and solve, that's super key. And just a lot of times it just starts with meeting other people. Yeah. There are really good workshops like that you can facilitate with just writing on a whiteboard, getting everybody to write down, here are some big things that, impact me directly, right? And I think keeping it closer and personal to you, to like, so instead of saying, the way the political administration of is handling this is bothering me or whatnot. Like, you want to get it closer and more local to something that you could at least talk to the people that have the effect. So like, you want to get it within your orbit, and then, but just writing down together what those common things are and finding commonalities between them, and then starting to look at opportunities that you all collectively have for even if it's just like, we have paper and pen, we can write a letter together and we can all sign it. We can organize this or that. And I think just doing that with a sense of just openness and being good towards other people, even if you disagree with them, I think is a really good strategy to do in the beginning. And clearly stating your problem and how it affects you. It's actually one of the most effective things to do, is just to say, is to really just show when you're writing a letter or talking about defining a problem, is to really show like how that problem affects you or your family or your business, and the way and it prevents you from operating, and tell that story in a very clear way.
This is all great advice. It's great to have you back on the show after all those months. I'd like to think that some incremental progress has been made on some of these tough issues that I try to explore here, possibly as a result of doing these conversations.
Well, what have you learned since the start of this pandemic?
I have learned that, I guess, that some things have been reinforced. One of which is that America is very broken in how it relates to itself in many ways. Although I keep seeing hints of people trying to find common ground, even when they come at each other, sort of reflexively at first. So I see the potential more than I did before, early in the year, for developing practices, almost like meditation or calisthenics. It's got to be sort of a practice. It's something you said at the beginning too. How do you self-awareness, knowing when your reflexes are taking you toward the wrong end of how to respond to somebody, and pausing. I've seen examples, hopeful examples, where that happens. I've also seen remarkable evolution of differences in people I know and care about really deeply, who've become at the opposite ends of the spectrum of belief on where we go from here, including, I'll say, my two sons, one at 30, one in 22, who diverged completely over the politics and of what's happened since the pandemic. And that's pretty wild. So in my own daily living, I'm dealing with the full span of belief on the pandemic and the politics around it, which is extraordinary. And that's reinforced for me the value of trying to do conversations like the ones I'm doing on here, but I want to make them wider even, and more open to having a full span of American voices and other voices when the issues are broader. So we're really capturing, understanding the differences, and finding common work zones, places where you can work. And their colleagues here at Columbia who are doing really essential work. There's this difficult conversations laboratory that I didn't know existed a year ago, and now I know. I'm working with them, Peter Coleman and others who've worked in sort of conflict and complexity, and how do you create progress, whether it's in a corporate realm, or whether it's world peace, or whether it's climate, or whether it's COVID-19. I have learned that social media, that part of the media landscape we call social media, is very broken, obviously, but still has great potential. That's why I haven't given up on my diurnal cycle. My clock is still mostly in the hopeful or enthusiastic end of things. And I've absolutely learned something that you've stressed here, which is that these problems are too big for one person, too big for one discipline, too big for one agency.
Yeah.
So the more we can work toward having a fluid capacity, like with wildfire, for the Forest Service to talk to FEMA, to talk to the standards folks, to really have open conversations. The same thing at Columbia across law, engineering, the folks doing climate resilience. That's an essential part of getting out of the fix we're in going forward. And it's not just, it's climate, it's COVID, it's all these issues that seem to defy our intelligence.
I'll post a couple things in the Twitter thread, but one is this video from, as I was mentioning earlier, Waldo Jaquith, when he was at 18F, sat before a committee in the state of Michigan to talk about technology reform. And apologies, didn't mean for the audio to come through, but I'll send out some links to that. Because what's really interesting is he specifically talks about, well, here's when there's like, they figured out like when something's gonna fail and not go great. Like if it's over $1 million, if you have over X number of people involved in it, you know, there's certain things that you can do, signals that you can know, hey, is this thing actually going to work out? What's the likelihood of it working out? Not just the merits, the idea, but just by the mechanics of how it's being set up.
That sounds great. I'll see. I think I found him doing a little bit of Googling.
Yeah, I'll pass it over in the thread here. But
right.
Great. Also, to your other point, there was seeing if I could pull up one image here. Oh yeah, this is that was Waldo Jaquith, which I'll pass a link over. I'll share it.
Yeah, you could share it in the share screen function if you want to.
Wonderful. This is around the idea of community and problem definition that we were talking about. This is a really great statement that we used a lot in government to evaluate problem, to basically write a problem. So if somebody had an idea or somebody wanted to, you know, pitch that we go build something, we would ask them to fill this out. There's a little Mad Libs thing. So basically saying that we've observed this thing, it could be a problem or opportunity. And we believe that if we do this, so it's like one thing, not like these 10 things,
right?
That it will result in this benefit for this group of people. And this part here is an attempt at kind of bringing out like, well, what is the bias that you have?
Right.
In this, and who does, from the beginning, because when we make stuff, it has bias in it. It's benefiting, you know, what does better mean, and better for who? And so how do we talk about that?
So this is like an initial stage of, and then you test the question with other communities, and then you test the actual idea or revise it and assess how it went.
Yeah, actually, well, there's actually within the federal government, there's an incubator called 10X for people in government to have ideas and to pitch it as a thing. So the 10X team had their belief was that the people closest to the problem knew the problem the best, not the people at the top. So so they have a range of funding that they're able to give out, and they have a 4-step process obviously it's got to be clear, it's got to show impact, it's got to be human-centered. But first, they ask people, to anybody at any level of government, to identify the problem, and they give them this problem statement to fill out. So this is, instead of like writing a 10-page thing, you write this, which is really kind of antithetical to like what people think. I got to write like a 5-page memo or something, no, you need to fill this out, it's kind of hard to fill out. So, but then they accept a bunch of them, and they do a round of investigation to say, is this a bad idea? And it's a couple weeks of just exploring and doing interviews to say, like, is it roughly a bad idea? The second phase is really kind of going deeper and say, is this a good idea? And to build a more understanding around the problem. And then phase 3 is, and they get increments, more money at each different phase. And phase 3, they do development and build it out. And in phase 4, they make sure that it's sustainable and that it's out there in the world, and that it can scale properly. So
That's great to know. And again, that's a model for Columbia. At the Earth Institute, we have internal grants. There's a process for Earth networks to form. It's a nascent thing.
Yeah.
To get groups across disciplines working on a question, but the architecture you're describing here looks like it's going to be helpful for that too. So this is great. Right there, that's something I can immediately throw into the mix as a way to sort of look at how these things can play out.
I'll toss that problem statement though into Twitter thread, because I found it to be incredibly helpful in terms of articulating my own project ideas. I've also found it very helpful when writing to a company and saying, hey, this bit of software I'm using isn't working. And it's a good frame and format, because it empowers the people on the other end to actually empathize with you and understand what your problems are and decide.
That's great. If there's any last thought you have related to practices or tools for thriving online and doing it sustainably, this is the hardest part. Is I think for a lot of folks, there's still some sense of, we're going to go back to some place we were in post-pandemic, as if this is going to just end with a vaccine. And
right,
I think so much. Even Bill Gates was saying, he projects, I can't remember which number it was, 50% reduction in works office time and 30% reduction in aviation travel, or maybe it was the other way around. But big changes are afoot, many of which ultimately will be productive and good. But it all will lead to a lot more of this, this.
Hopefully, well, what's funny about being in New Mexico is it's it's not that different than my life in New York, except I get to go outside,
Right.
And there's cactuses and birds and whatnot. But the view, the window is the same, and time, a lot of times, is the same, and that, to me, strikes me as an interesting problem or an interesting thing to explore. So, like, how can time and our rhythms change? What will cause them to change? Like, do they need to, is that a thing that's initiated by myself? Or are there different norms that can happen around time or when paying attention? Because all these things enable efficiency, but efficiency towards what? Towards, like, why should communication be more efficient? Why should it be faster? When should it be faster? When should it not be faster? And, like, are there interesting habits or norms that could develop around turning things off? And, like, what are the conditions in which, like, that becomes a norm or the way society operates?
So interesting. We'll end in a couple of minutes, but what you were saying about sort of re-examining the efficiency was certainly a big driver of a lot of online and data work. But there's been a lot of revisitation in the context of the pandemic and what it did for global commerce around supply chain efficiency. Corporations were all about just in time. The phrase just in time became kind of the mantra.
Yeah.
And now there's a lot of discussion. Well, we need actually to go back to having less of the discussion around efficiency, more about redundancy, more about quality. And that seems to be part of what you're talking about in this context as well. And by the way, James Edward Abelard on LinkedIn has been asking, Jeremy, can you post the links in the chat? I'm not sure how to capture them from sharing. I've put a few of them. I'll just say to James, I'll add them in LinkedIn in the comments afterwards.
Yeah, and I'll drop a few in LinkedIn as well. So
yeah, and I'll share this broadcast live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So it's hard to maintain those conversations all together. But we'll do our best to answer. James had a question earlier, more specifically about 18F and how it is distinguished from other government entities. But so you might want to.
I'll follow up over there, James. Yep. So
this has been great, though. I'm hoping maybe we can get you back on more frequently than every 8 months or whatever it's been, because I always find it illuminating to talk with you. I hope it's useful for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could. There's so many other people too. I would like to introduce you and the rest of the climate sustainability community to think a lot about this stuff in terms of technology and doing it in a way that is good for people, good for the earth.
That's kind of what it's about.
Yeah.
Theoretically. Well, thanks, Jeremy Zilar. Folks can find out more about Jeremy by going to jeremyzilar.com. Follow him on Twitter at Jeremy Zilar, as his name is spelled there. He's a good friend of mine, one of my favorite explorers of this online universe we find more and more of our brains locked in on. And thanks again, Jeremy, for being part of this Thriving Online episode of our Sustain What broadcast. On Wednesday, the great Ruth DeFries, who's a professor of sustainable development in Columbia, a MacArthur winning scientist who studies complex systems in nature and our lives, human systems. She has a new book out, What Would Nature Do? Looking for principles and lessons from natural systems under stress for what are unnatural and synthetic and manufactured systems are undergoing right now with the pandemic and climate change. She's a friend and a great explorer. And Tamara Haspel, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, will be with me as well. On Friday, we're going to do another session on basically on leadership in this time of rapid change and complexity. And it really builds right off of the conversation we're having with Jeremy right now. And next Monday, back on Thriving Online, we'll have a session on what to do offline to sustain your capacity to be effective online. Richard Louv, who wrote the great book about kids and nature years ago, no child left inside, essentially was his mantra. And Paul Greenberg, who has a new book out on how to put down your phone and pick up a stone or the real world as a way to maintain your capacity. Angelica Patterson, a great botanist from Columbia, will show us how to interact with nature and with a device, perhaps, in ways that can make difference. But again, Jeremy, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Andy.
This is all part of what I do here at the Earth Institute. Thanks to Director Alex Halliday, who brought me here a little over a year ago to build an initiative on communication and sustainability. You can get in touch with ideas or feedback. Let me know what to do differently. Look at that scrolling bar at the bottom for ways to connect with me, connect with others. Share this as soon as it's done. Share the link you're watching on. It all gets archived, and we can build this conversation going forward. And wherever you are, don't socially distance, physically distance. Don't share the air with other people, as my friend Randy Olson says. Don't swap your air, but you can swap ideas, and do so here anytime that we're broadcasting regularly. Thanks again, Jeremy. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.